For me, when I look at the Africa Climate Summit and being a part of it and watching all of these actors together, one of the more pivotal outcomes was that, that you had all of these actors working towards one singular outcome.
I mean, of course, there were significant outcomes when you look at the Nairobi Declaration document. But for me, I think some of the key outcomes was buttressing on the just energy transition.
There was a lot of money that was set aside to go into agriculture and smart agriculture and everything that's on that. So it's now for young people to tap into the agricultural sector and say, what can I do?
So the outcomes that bordered on climate finance were the most important, both at the African Climate Summit and at COP28.
I think, earlier on when I was talking about just this idea of bringing all of these actors together in a very cohesive way, I think one thing that, governments had started to realize is that people are doing a lot of different things, and we're all sort of approaching this in different ways, and we don't have one voice. As Africans, we need to have one voice when we talk about a just transition. We need to have one voice when we're making demands as far as, a loss and damage fund is concerned, or we need to have one voice when we're thinking about, the climate finance commitments that have been made and that have not been met to date. How do we have a synchronized sort of, one voice addressing these issues together? So I think this was, for me, when I look at the Africa Climate Summit and being a part of it and watching all of these actors together, one of the more pivotal outcomes was that, that you had all of these actors working towards one singular outcome. I think it was also an opportunity to sort of bring the investment community together as well, to really see what the opportunity in the region is. You had commitments coming out of this particular summit from Denmark, you had from commitments coming out of Saudi Arabia, all towards sort of boosting the climate finance access within the continent. And another sort of big area is also just valuing ecosystem services, valuing the resources that this continent has to offer in addressing the climate crisis, and now starting to have conversations with different governments, different investors who are not just willing to pay for these services, but also sort of translate that into, how do we help the African economy as a whole adapt to the impacts of climate change? So I would say those are some of the bigger outputs that came. There was obviously the Nairobi Declaration as well that was signed by governments that were present. But, all in all, it's just a more unified voice towards, what are the expectations of the continent? And then how do we also just value the services that the continent brings to the table? But a lot of conversations also just seeing Africa as, as I mentioned earlier, more than just a problem. This is really the center of the answers to the climate crisis. When you think about our rich resources, natural resources, and the potential for carbon sequestration in this continent is tremendous. How do we value that appropriately, right? You're seeing, thinking about our populous continent, right? A youthful continent, more than 60% of the population. So also when we talk about green jobs and the opportunities, you're really seeing that a lot of the answers are coming from the people in this continent purely just because of our numbers and the fact that we're such a youthful population. There's also conversations around the actual natural resources that are required and needed for a green transition. So these are all found in this continent as well. So just a lot of, I think, almost a wake-up moment, for the world and for Africa as well, as well, to sort of wake up and say, hold on a minute. We've been looked at in this way for such a long time, but the reality is that we are actually in a very powerful position. And how do we begin to act, from that point of power rather than a point of sort of always needing, to be looked at like we just don't know what we're doing or we don't have the answers. This was really an opportunity for people to wake up and see things differently.
Yeah, interesting enough, for young, one of the outcomes that came both from the Africa Climate Summit and the COP28 was the fact that we admitted the planet, as we admitted that oil was one of the biggest contributors of the climate crisis. But we also determined and we also agreed that we need climate financing. So a lot of pledges were made. And that's where the opportunity is for young people. Because with these pledges come new openings and new doors For example, there was a lot of money that was set aside to go into agriculture and smart agriculture and everything that's on that. So it's now for young people to tap into the agricultural sector and say, what can I do? Can I start a small fishery? Can I start a small, how can I do a smart farming and everything? There was a lot of money that went into energy, clean energy and everything. So it's now for the youth to think, what can we do about solar? What can we do about such other kinds of briquettes or anything else? So it's actually much more of, for young people, it's much more of a job creation resource than anything else.
Some key I mean, of course, there were significant outcomes when you look at the Nairobi Declaration document. But for me, I think some of the key outcomes was buttressing on the just energy transition, which is what are the resources that Africa has? How do we drive towards green industrialization, but at the same time in a way that is just and fair? The reason why that's important is you have different countries that are at different levels. So you have countries like Kenya that are 93% green in their energy. So you're not necessarily looking for a transition in that case. What you're looking for is how do we unlock more energy to be developed in this country for a green industry. Where else you have other countries that are either still using fossil fuels or fossil fuels is a big part of their economic of the economy. And so we need to be a little bit more deliberate about how do we have those countries transition in a way that allows them to develop, allows them to utilize their resources right now to build a better future for their population, but yet still keeping the larger goal at we're trying to become green, we're trying to get to the place where as a continent, we remain a net zero contributor, or we remain, we don't become a greater contributor to the climate change problem.
The key outcomes of the summit are those that are around climate finance. We see that on the African continent, finance and the proper application of it has been the problem with the development of climate-friendly development on the African continent. So the outcomes that bordered on climate finance were the most important, both at the African Climate Summit and at COP28.